Welcome to another episode of Road to East. I am Humayun Khan, your anchor, and today with me we have Andrew Small, a very famous, renowned international scholar who is a transatlantic fellow at the German Marshall Fund in the United States. And apart from that, he is also a non-resident senior policy fellow at the European Council of Foreign Relations. He is author of many articles. He contributes regularly in international journals and newspapers, and he is also an author of the famous book China-Pakistan Axis: Geopolitics of Asia. Thank you, Andrew, for giving us your time.
Sure, delighted to do it.
Today we are living in a global economy and global world, and everything revolves around economy. Recently, United States of America and China have signed a trade deal which has been called as a phase one deal, which was a culmination of 18 months of trade war between the two giants, global giants. So I would like to know, what is your personal take on how this deal is seen as in DC? And also, since you follow on Chinese affair as well, how does this deal is viewed in Beijing as well?
So, the phase one trade deal was essentially a kind of truce before the elections. They needed, on the US side, to diffuse things in order to have a clear run on the economy in the run-up to the November elections on the US side. But what that represents, therefore, is essentially a failure to achieve the really expansive objectives that were set out, and that they were still negotiating pretty much up till the summer of last year. The goals of the negotiation were not just to have a kind of purchasing agreement between China and the US to address the bilateral deficit. That's certainly what Donald Trump wanted, but the objectives of the main negotiator, the US Trade Representative Bob Lighthizer, what they were really pushing for with these tariffs was to create enough pressure to induce more serious structural change in the Chinese economy. All of the issues around subsidies and the kind of all the concerns on structural economic reform, IP, these kinds of things. And so up until about the summer, all of these things were still under negotiation. At a certain point, it became clear that China wasn't going to move on the big issues, and so then the question was going to be whether you continue escalating tariffs or whether you're able to find a way to kind of call a truce of a certain sort, which is what essentially this is. They could have got a deal like this well before all the tariffs were put in place. The Chinese would have offered a deal that looks pretty much like this. This is the easier things in a sense to do. The problems with the deal, therefore, are it's something that looks very much like managed trade. If on the US side the objective of this was to try and bring about a different approach to how the economy is run, this is actually a kind of reversion to precisely the kind of state-directed behavior on, in this case, large-scale purchases of specific US goods in the agricultural sector and in the energy sector and things that, in a sense, they were trying to get past with some of the other elements of the negotiations. The other thing is the tariffs. Most of the tariffs are still in place. And so from the Chinese perspective, it's not such a great deal in terms of major sanctions or major tariff relief, rather. Almost all of the tariffs that had originally been put in place have been left intact. The agreement was essentially that you wouldn't have new tariffs put on top of that. So it's kind of a freeze. In principle, they're supposed to move into phase two negotiations, but in practice, I think there's very little expectation that you're going to see any movement on that before the elections. From the Chinese perspective, there were advantages, of course, to the fact that they didn't have to concede on the really big and difficult issues, which were this very kind of intrusive monitoring system that the US side wanted to put in, and really taking on these big structural economic questions. So for them, it kind of it creates a level of predictability because, as much of the issue around the tariffs was not just the actual economic cost, it was the fact that it was a highly unpredictable environment for Chinese business. And so knowing, at least in the run-up to the elections, that it's going to pretty much look like it is, has some advantages, eases the pressure somewhat. It also means in the end, I think that China's been able to see off a kind of unilateral version of an effort from the US side to create enough pressure to push China to do some of the difficult things that it didn't really want to do.
My second question is associated with the first one, which we have discussed about this, how global economy is being affected by these two giants fighting and now eventually signing a deal. But this question has like two parts. First, how does the global economy is being affected now that China is facing a global pandemic of coronavirus for last month and a half? And the second part is, how do you see Chinese efforts in terms of dealing with this coronavirus? It has been appreciated by a lot of countries. It has been appreciated by WHO. What is your take on these two questions?
Well, on the economic impact, it's still a little early to tell. I mean, there's still a lot of things we don't know when the Chinese economy is going to kind of resume full functionality. It's been a fairly dramatic shutdown. Of course, it means that the Q1 numbers are going to look bad. The economy was kind of a slightly lower ebb for reasons that partly related to the US-China trade war and partly related to some internal dynamics. So it's certainly going to be a hit for the Chinese economy, and therefore, in a certain sense, a hit for the global economy too. And there have been specific implications in sectors that have been reliant on production facilities. In China, for instance, there have been shortages in sectors that are dependent on that. It's not necessarily just the net economic impact for the Chinese economy as a whole. It's the fact that so many firms have located their production facilities there that if you have the kind of lockdown that we saw over the coronavirus and is still to some extent underway, it has a huge impact on global value chains that are dependent on it. So that's harder to read the numbers on that so far, and it will again depend on when the Chinese economy resumes kind of really normal functionality. In terms of the response to the virus, again, there's still data that we don't have on the overall numbers. At present, it appears to be declining outside the kind of epicenter in Hebei and in Wuhan. I think there's certainly appreciation from certain places around the world for what China's done on this. It's been tremendous. It's been very difficult for the Chinese people to have to deal with it. It's a huge mobilization that's required from any government to have to deal with something like this. I think there's been concern. There's still concern about the level of transparency that's there on the Chinese side. I was concerned particularly in the early phase of the pandemic, particularly in terms of how the local authorities were dealing with it in Wuhan, the arrests of the doctors that were raising the alarm about the virus in the first place. I think the trust level between China and a number of kind of Western actors, including the US, but others beyond, isn't necessarily there on all of these questions. I think it's the picture has changed somewhat in the last few weeks.
Andrew, the last question I would like to know, how do you see USA's senior government official criticizing Belt and Road, and particularly CPAC in last couple of years? Last year in December, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, Ambassador Alice Well, in a speech in Woodrow Wilson, criticized CPAC quite a lot. And then last month she was in Pakistan, and at a think tank, she also reiterated her concerns and criticized CPAC. How do you see a senior US official criticizing another country's domestic affair, and B, what is your take on how the CPAC is taken by the US policymakers?
Some elements of the criticisms that were made in Alice Wells' remarks are criticisms that one has heard in the debate here as well from different voices. I think lots of the things that were said weren't necessarily new or things that other internal critics haven't shared on this. I still think, in terms of analysing what was intended, by all of this. Clearly, we are moving into a phase in which US-China competition on the strategic economic issues is intensifying. The US, beyond the specific case of CPAC, has been taking a highly critical stance on the Belt and Road in a number of different environments. If anything, CPAC is one of the last cases to get this kind of scrutiny from US officials, but this isn't unusual if you look at what US officials at various levels have been saying in other contexts as well, basically since about summer of 2018 when the US launched the economic strand of its free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. So I'd see it more in terms of the US-China information or propaganda battles over the future of China's economic role in the world, the models that different countries are choosing in that regard, rather than something that was entirely directed at Pakistan itself, even if those remarks were made here too. On the remarks that were made specifically about CPAC, I think the critique that's been made of the speech is as much, what alternative offer was the US making, and this has been made on the Belt and Road as a whole. If you're going to take a critical position on something like CPAC, for all of the flaws that were laid out, that was the infrastructure finance that was in place. It will obviously look different if the US is able to mobilize significant alternative financing as well. At the moment, that's not necessarily happened yet. I think at the same time, there were some of the points that were made, given that they are in some cases shared here as well, are not necessarily unreasonable points of criticism. Whether in the grand scheme of the relationship between the US and Pakistan, this was an entirely well-judged speech to make is another question. I think that in some respects at the moment, the approach that the US has been taking, even when some of the criticisms are fair, until there's a really fully fledged alternative that's been laid out on the US side, it can seem like kind of unfair carping rather than something that's that countries are necessarily interested in hearing. In lots of cases, countries have made up their own minds about how they want to deal with the Belt and Road, how they want to deal with China, how they want to deal with Chinese investments. They're not necessarily ignorant of the risks involved.
Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard about the views of Andrew Small on all these 4 topics. In the end, he has given what his personal views on this particular topic. Pakistan has been a very close ally of China, and currently China is facing this grave pandemic virus called coronavirus, and the way China has been fighting with this virus, it is commendable. The Senate of Pakistan, the National Assemblies of Pakistan, and many other people, the Prime Minister, the President, the civil society, everybody at this critical juncture is standing by the Chinese, and we really think and believe that China is able to take this fight to its logical conclusion and will defeat coronavirus. And the standards China has set in terms of fighting this pandemic, they are absolutely amazing. With this, I would like to thank you for your time, and please keep watching Road to East, and we will come again in next week with a new topic and a new guest. Thank you.